Hi, Masha. How are you
Well,
doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing okay.
I
What do you got today?
have a good question today. I want to ask you about the concept of the chosen people. And what do you think that
Oh,
that role is today in a global Jewish community?
mm. Yeah. So the whole idea of chosen people is, it's something that is complicated. I maybe going even so far to say embattled, even in ancient times.
Mhm.
Um, the idea that God chose the Israelites from among all peoples and chose to have a special relationship with only them
Mhm.
is contradicted even in the Torah itself. The Torah makes clear that the God has a special relationship with the Israelites, and God may have a special relationship with many, many other peoples as well.
Mhm.
Um, so it one in Deuteronomy, for example, it when it's talking about why the Israelites shouldn't follow the practices of other peoples, it says those were not given to you.
Mhm.
So it's not that those are wrong or bad or evil. It's that that's not the ones for you. I might have
Mhm.
had, I says God might have had a relationship with the Amorites, and that's the thing I gave them to do. That's not your job. Your job is this one.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I think there's an argument to be made that even in the Torah, certainly in the Tanakh, I mean the Hebrew Bible, there's an idea that God is making distinctions among different peoples. Different peoples are not all the same,
Mhm.
but the idea that the Jews were uniquely chosen by God and other peoples weren't, it's a
Mhm.
hard thing to sustain. You know,
Mhm.
there's this famous passage where I feel like we maybe talked about this before, but in the very reading in the Torah where it says, you are special to me, essentially,
Mhm.
the rabbis chose a companion piece from the prophets that says, where God says to the prophet, speaking to the Israelites, to me, you were just like the Ethiopians. Yeah, I brought you out of Egypt, but I brought the Ethiopians out of their land, and I brought this group out of that land, and I've got. So, in other words, you're not special. Yes,
Mhm.
you're different, but
Mhm.
everybody else is different also. So, the idea that different peoples are unique and have a unique destiny, that's definitely supported by Jewish tradition. The idea that somehow that means elevation of the Jewish people above all other peoples, that's something that some people came up with much later, but it's not well
Mhm.
supported. Certainly not by the Hebrew Bible. Um, and the ancient rabbis also, were not so big on that one. They thought the Jews did have a particular mission, but they were open to the idea that others might have a mission also that might be
Mhm.
equally divine. And famously, Maimonides in the Middle Ages made a big argument that the groups that the Torah seems to condemn, right? The Torah does go to great pains to condemn certain peoples that lived previously in the land of Israel, like the Canaanites,
Mhm.
okay, that lived in that land.
Mhm.
Um, Maimonides said those peoples don't exist today. In other words, you can't look at the other peoples around you, like especially in his time, Christians and Muslims,
Mhm.
and say, oh, those are those seven nations that we were supposed to wipe out. No,
Mhm.
they are not. And he, in fact, made the argument that they pray to the same God that we pray to. Their ideas of holiness and the divine are similar to what ours are, and even to the point where he would say that if non-Jews who are Christians or Muslims at least made prayers in his terms, that Jews should say Amen. In other words, that there's a confluence. There's actually a lot that connects us,
Mhm.
even though Jews are this distinct group.
Mhm.
So this was a real big concern in the United States around the early 20th century, in the 20s
Mhm.
and 30s, when there were some people, notably Mordecai Kaplan, the founder of the Reconstructionist movement, who said, this doctrine of chosenness has got to go. It's holding
Mhm.
us back. It's misunderstood. We have to just discard it. So he actually
Mhm.
wrote his own prayer book in which he took every place where it says, you chose us among the nations or something like that. He took that out and replaced it with
Mhm.
different language. Now, he didn't exactly get a very good reaction when he did this. In fact, a group of rabbis actually took his prayer book and burned it, and declared that they were going to put him in cherem. They were going to excommunicate him somehow from the Jewish community. That not something people could actually do at that point, but okay, they tried. But that idea that that at the very least we might talk about distinction, about difference, but not talk about hierarchy in connection with that difference. That's something that spread throughout the 20th century, and really great thinkers like the recently deceased Rabbi Jonathan Sachs wrote a whole book about that, about distinction, arguing that it's not about election. It's about saying there are distinctive paths in the world. And I think the argument he might make, that I might make, is that we're not necessarily well served by saying all paths are the same, right? It's not going to increase interfaith understanding or even understanding between people to say, well, we're all essentially the same. There's really no difference between these paths. It's the problems we get into is when we start to say, there is this path, which is right, and this path, which is wrong. So, so I think that's, even today when, some of the prayers that we say, that say we were chosen for various reasons, like the prayer for Torah study that says you chose us among the people and gave us your Torah. Some people make the argument, well, it's talking about historically, like Torah came to the world through the Jewish people, so that's actually what it's referring to. Others would say, actually, maybe we don't want to say chosen in that context, and they use a different blessing that says you drew us close to your service, as a way of saying, something that the ancients said as well, which was when the Torah was given at Mount Sinai, it wasn't given to the Jews. It was given to the world. The Jews were there, but it was actually for everybody, and we shouldn't be saying that Jews have unique and sole claim to it, and that we're elect. And I think it's important, even though I've gone on for a while, I think it is important to note that there is something to the idea that in a time, especially say in medieval times, when Jews were dying because they were Jews, when they were really undergoing a lot of persecution and oppression, the idea of election was something that helped people get through. Yeah. To think that there's some reason that we're suffering, and there's some nobility, some noble cause that we're part of, and that gives us comfort in the midst of our oppression. It's notable that the strongest voices against the idea of chosenness have come in the United States, in a place where Jews are in a good position relative to the rest of Jewish history, where people have started to say, maybe chosenness has been either misunderstood or maybe even needs to be discarded as an idea.
Well, my second follow-up question, I think, pivots a little bit away from what you were mentioning, but I'm curious about how the idea of genealogy and region-specific elements of the Torah influence the global Jewish community that may not be able to trace roots back to the stories in the Jewish Bible.
So you're talking about like the idea of blood, right? Of like blood descent, like when Jews say, "Oh, our father Abraham," right? So, again, for a very long time, those terms were understood to be metaphors. And to be understood figuratively, that we are spiritually descended from Abraham, that we trace our maybe our intellectual history to Moses, but not that we're literally descended from those people. And we know that the Jewish people are descended from lots of people who took on Judaism at different points, and that's why Jewish people look different. Right? The Jewish people are not a race. The Jewish people are not one ethnic group. Jews look like everybody in the world. So there's Jews in every ethnicity and of every skin color. So it's a claimed genealogy, not a literal genealogy, right? At the same time, in terms of the method of what defines who is a Jew, descent is an important part of that, right? But then now, since the time of the rabbis, there's two paths. There's descent and there's choice, right? So that if somebody is descended from Jews, they're a Jew. And if somebody chooses to be a Jew and chooses those mythic ancestors as their own, they're no less a Jew. They're equally a Jew. But in our time, as you were pushing toward, I think, we commonly say every Jew is choosing to be a Jew, because in many, certainly in the United States, but in also other parts of the world, one could choose not to be, even despite one's descent, right? One could say, as so many people say to me, I have a Jewish family. My parents were Jewish, right? And not identify themselves as a Jew. So many people will say all Jews today are choosing Jews. We choose. It's like the whole issue of whether God chose the Jewish people. It's really Jews are choosing to identify as Jews, and others do not make that choice. And I think that's just becoming much more important, and has continued to be more important in the last couple hundred years than this idea of something happened way back then. And even in the Talmud, right? Even in the Talmud, there's the story they tell about God looking around for a people and the Israelites choosing that path, like choosing to follow God as opposed to not doing it. So they actually had a choice at the very, very beginning.